It's 7:44 in the Parisian suburb of Nanterre. A car is stopped by two police officers. The driver is 17-year-old Nahel Merzouk. He's at the wheel of a 70,000 euro Mercedes and doesn't have a driver's license. In a normal city, he steps out of the car, gets arrested, and faces a minor sentence as a juvenile. But this is not a normal city. It's the banlieue. Nahel refuses to get out of the car. One of the cops pulls out his gun to threaten him to get out, and as the car attempts to drive away, the car crashes a bit further down the road, and despite the best efforts of medical first responders, Nahel is dead. In Paris, the policeman would get arrested. There is an investigation, and later, if deemed necessary, a trial. Justice is served. But this isn't Paris. The police officer lies about acting in self-defense, a video of the incident is leaked, and protests start. Only with the leaking of the video would an investigation start, with the police officer facing a 30-year prison sentence for voluntary homicide. In a normal world, the promise of justice is enough. But this is not a normal world. It's France, and this isn't the first time that this has happened. So why didn't Nahel stop? Why did the cop open fire? Why wasn't the promise of justice enough? And has France reached a tipping point? Before we talk about the protests, we have to talk about the protesters and the deep rift that exists within French society. At the heart of the riots are the inhabitants of the French banlieue. While banlieue was just a word for an outlying area of a city, it has come to mean segregated, immigrant-descended communities on the margins of French society. They first emerged in the 1960s and 70s out of France's need for labor for its industry. Companies like Renault or Peugeot would tour rural areas of France's former African colonies to hire workers, which would then be housed in new urban developments surrounding major cities. While they were first hired on temporary contracts, these were extended and became permanent as companies sought to keep the most skilled laborers. Families were brought over and people started building lives. But as France deindustrialized, its factories and mines closed down and cut jobs, and many of the migrants that had come on the promise of opportunity became jobless. And to make matters worse, the low educational background of these rural migrants made it difficult to change careers or integrate in society. Over time, some turned to making a living in a parallel economy, centered around theft and drug trafficking, and the banlieues progressively became hubs of criminal activity. The parallel economy and the confrontation it generated with the police in turn led to the emergence of parallel societies, where French institutions, including the school system and cultural values, held little sway and struggled to take roots, making it fertile ground for extremist ideology. Successive waves of both legal and illegal migration since then mean that roughly 5 million people, or roughly 8% of France's population, live in about 700 banlieue areas. And the split between those communities and broader French society is much wider than in other Western European countries, who also welcome migrants at the same time. In French, it's commonly known as la fracture, or the rift. On one hand of this divide, there is the secular French majority from Catholic heritage, and on the other, there is the mostly immigrant-descended communities of the banlieue, a significant number of which are Muslim. And while some would have la fracture be the sole result of systemic racism and religiousness, it's much more than that. And while it's true that job applicants with foreign-sounding names are less likely to get answers to job interviews, that also counts for applicants with addresses registered in the banlieue. Today, 20% of people born from foreign parents and 23% of Muslims in France agree entirely with the statement that societies like France that have a colonial past were and will remain racist. The rift is a social-cultural divide rather than one based solely on ethnicity, especially considering that France has always had the aspirational principle of equality ingrained in its national model, while at the same time expecting far greater levels of cultural assimilation from the newcomers and their descendants than in other European countries. This is especially true when it comes to religion, where laïcité, the French conception of secularism, involves the removal of religion from public space. The thing is that the problems that affect France at large are amplified in the banlieue, where youth unemployment is double the already high French national average. The French educational system, which has equally suffered in the past decades, is under more pressure in the banlieue, where different cultural backgrounds make teaching more difficult, on top of which teachers are routinely mistreated and assaulted by students. And if you read the news headlines from much of the past decades, there are two main competing stories about the banlieue. The first is that of a forgotten, left behind part of France that needs to be helped, and the other is that of a lost France, or a France of no-go zones which supposedly needs to be reconquered. And when we look at the numbers, despite the disconnect, the banlieue don't look particularly forgotten, with 100 billion euros having been spent over the course of the past 20 years in trying to fix them, alongside the most generous social spending system in the world. Yet the banlieue are still disengaged from French politics, with high rates of abstention in elections, meaning they have little voice in the national political debate. And so, feeling rejected by France, the banlieue have developed a culture of defiance of French institutions in general, but particularly of the police, with which there are high levels of mutual distrust. And that brings us to the protests and riots. So, I know what you're thinking. The French are always protesting, and it's a national sport which is avidly shared by news stations across the world. And while that may be true, we need to look at how different this protest was to the 2018 Gilets jaunes protests or even the previous nationwide banlieue riots from 2005. And if we look at the timeline of the largest protest movements at a national level in France over the past 30 years, it looks a little something like this. Large protests regularly take place on legislation, with the retirement age and public sector reform being the largest cause for the French to go out into the streets. These protests, which are mainly made of public workers, the lower middle class, and trade unionists, react to the political news cycle. And the thing is, they also have seen significant rioting and looting, with the 2018 Gilets jaunes protests having caused nearly as much damage as the 2005 riots. But the banlieue riots are not the same demographic, don't have the same triggers, and usually don't take place in the same areas. And yet they follow a relatively consistent dynamic, which is important to note for the rest of the story. First, there is a period of tension at the local or national level as the state cracks down on the criminal economy. Then an incident resulting from excessive force by police results in one or several deaths. The event is both seen as racially motivated and an attack against the community. This sparks a riot which causes severe damage to city infrastructure. More police is deployed to contain the protests, which eventually simmer down after a few days or weeks. Finally, the government then makes some kind of plan to rebuild the city and make some pledges to deal with the banlieue's problems. Yet every time this happens, there is an escalation of violence and prejudice, which only increases the repression by both the police and the violence of the rioters. But the thing is, up until now, the riots in the banlieue were just that, confined to the banlieue. And while in previous riots there was extensive media coverage, the relative geographic isolation meant that they, for the most part, could be ignored. The first victims of these riots are the people, businesses, and public services of the banlieues themselves, where most of the buildings and cars have gone up in flames. Yet for the first time in June and July 2023, riots have made their way to city centers of cities like Paris, Lyon, or Marseille. A whole segment of French society for whom the riots were just a distant occurrence or something they saw on TV are now confronted head-on with this new reality. As a result, there has been a massive surge of support towards the usually unpopular police, a shift to the right in public opinion, and a hardening of public discourse. In response to the riots, two police unions declared themselves at war with hordes of savages, with some of the far right calling it the beginning of an ethno-religious war. The banlieue can no longer simply be neglected as they have in the past, both for the criminality that they house and for the poverty of its citizens. The failure of French integration policy over the past 40 years is not only on display across the world,
say nearly 1,000 protesters were arrested,
but as ever for French citizens. And to tackle this problem, there seems to be several possible complementary courses of action the government could take to clean up the banlieue, repair the fracture, and eventually integrate or assimilate their inhabitants. France could take up the task to reform its police, which has gotten less selective and shortened training times over the past decades to help avoid some of the incidents and its very real statistical and hence racial profiling problem. It's a move that would prove unpopular with the police, which has repeatedly refused accusations of racism. The other course of action would be to attempt to crack down on the criminality that undermines the banlieue and contributes to the tension with police. But that would involve a doubling down on the repression, which in every riot has proved to be a failed recipe, and thus trigger further rioting. Finally, France could look to change the dynamics of the banlieue through urban planning, to better connect the banlieue with the rest of the country. But the thing is, between 1977 and 2018, there have been no less than 10 plans to improve the conditions of people living in the banlieue, where the government has burned cash on what people have called uninspired fresh coats of paint on top of a failing system, rather than structural reforms. And the riots have made it hard to justify helping out areas and people that burn their own buses, their own schools, and their own libraries.
But none of these things would change what seems to be the underlying problem: France's model of integration and how generations of migrants and their descendants have responded to it. And that means rebuilding a system with more opportunity, doubling down on education, and perhaps even changing how France relates to newcomers.
In fact, the problem has festered for so long that for France it will take political will, money, and most importantly, time to mend the rift. The French public is angry. Their cities have now been attacked not just by Islamist extremists coming from the banlieue, but as they will perceive it, by the banlieue in their entirety. This has been a massive psychological shock for France, and the political consequences will be massive as well. While France's 2027 presidential elections are still 4 years away, the riots have started a countdown. And France's centrist political forces will need to find a solution before it runs out. This was Into Europe. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in how the cycle of violence that I talked about in this video happens, I would recommend 2 French movies called La Haine and Les Misérables, which goes a little bit more in depth into this topic from an artistic point of view. Additionally, if you like this video, feel free to check out the Into Europe Patreon to help me make more videos like this one.